The most important weapon you own, or tool that you possess, is your imagination. Look around you. Everything you're looking at was brought into being or shaped by the imagination. Someone thought of it first. And that goes way back. Once upon a time, someone tired of sitting on the ground imagined a stool or a chair. Fairy tales become reality. Dreams come true. The advances people have made began with imagining. It doesn't have to be like this, someone thought. It can be different. Imagine. It's how worlds get changed. I didn't set out to be a crossover author. It just never occurred to me not to be. To put it another way, what I wanted to be was the kind of writer who told whatever stories he wanted to, in whatever medium he wanted to. And I seem more or less to have got to that place. So I can tell you how I did it. I'm not sure I can tell you how you could do it too. My first book was a children's book. I was about 22 when I wrote it, and I sent it to one publisher, and it came back with a nice note from the editor saying that it wasn't quite right for them, and I put it away forever. I was a journalist for a while. It would be accurate to say that all I knew of being a journalist when I began being a journalist was what I gleaned from the 1983 edition of the Writer and Artist Yearbook. And then, when I got tired of journalism, I wrote comics, mostly for grown-ups. And once I'd learned to write comics to my own satisfaction and thought it might be good fun to go and explore prose fiction, I was already thoroughly spoiled. The joy of writing comics is that it's a medium that people mistake for a genre. Nobody seemed to mind when I was writing comics that I lurched from historical to fantasy, to spy stories, to autobiography, to children's fiction, to horror, because it was all comics. And that was a freedom that I treasured. I started writing my first real children's book in 1991. It was a scary story for my daughter Holly, called Caroline. Holly used to come home every day from kindergarten and she'd see me writing. So she'd climb up on my lap and dictate stories to me that I had to write down. And they were absolutely terrifying, as only the stories of a 4-year-old girl could be. Most of them involved small girls, often named Holly, who would get home to find that their mothers had been replaced by evil witches, and who would then lock them in the cellar, and then they'd have to get out and try and go to America. So I thought I'd try and write her one of these stories. I couldn't find anything like that around on the shelves, possibly looking back on it with good reason. But she liked stories like that, so I started writing one, and it was called Caroline. And I showed the first couple of chapters to my editor, the man who had edited my book, Good Omens, Richard Evans, at Golan's Publishers. And he was a smart man and a lovely man and a very, very good editor. And he looked at this. And the next time I saw him, he called me over and he said, Neil, I read those first couple of chapters of that book you did, Caroline, and I've got to say it's the best thing you've ever done. But it is unpublishable. And I said, why? And he said, well, you seem to be writing a horror novel that is aimed both at children and at adults, he said. And I don't think we could publish a horror novel for children. And I don't think anybody could publish anything that both adults and children are meant to get to read at the same time. So I said, thank you. And I put the book away. And shortly thereafter, we moved to America. And I planned to keep writing the book in my own time. But there wasn't really very much of my own time. And one day I looked and now Holly was probably a bit too old for the book, or getting that way, and I had a new daughter, and I thought I better do something with this before they're both too old. So I sent the manuscript to my editor at Avon Books, a lady named Jennifer Hershey, and she phoned me up and she said, "It's great. What happens next?" And I said, "Send me a contract and we will both find out." And bless her, she did. And she wasn't really worried about how she was going to publish it. And the contract was for, I think, 5% of what I got as an advance for my last novel. But it was a contract. Somebody was now waiting. And 2 years passed. The whole idea was that I would have somehow more time once I'd signed this contract, but I didn't. More time had not happened. So I cheated, and I stopped reading before bed. And instead, I started writing before bed. I just kept a notebook with a pen beside the bed, and I'd get into bed at night. Instead of reading 4 or 5 pages of something and go to sleep, I would write half a page and go to sleep. And then I went on a comic book Little Defense Fund cruise. I'm not very good at things like cruises. So what I was meant to be officially sunbathing, I'd actually be writing. Nobody knew that was what I was doing. Well, I could have done it, sort of come up close, but I fooled everybody into thinking I was doing cruise things, but really I was writing Caroline. I got home and I handed the book in. And suddenly everybody was very excited about it. And a book which had been unpublishable in 1991 suddenly wasn't. The entire landscape of publishing had changed. And the success of the books that had crossed over, the Lemony Snicket books, the Harry Potter books, Philip Pullman's His Dark Materials, suddenly made the idea of a book that could be published for children and for adults a feasible goal. Now, Caroline was published in the summer of 2002, which was, coincidentally, but rather wonderfully, the first summer in 5 years without a new Harry Potter book. So journalists who they'd had their common inches set aside to write about the new Harry Potter book suddenly had empty pages. So they had to write about something. And Michael Chabon, who will be here in a few days' time, published a book called Summerland at exactly the same time. There were a couple of others, so they would fill article space with things saying how adult authors were now writing children's fiction. Because I'd written Caroline and Michael had written Summerland. And it was wonderful. We got lots and lots of column inches. And initially, I think it's fair to say that adults bought the book. Children came in and discovered Caroline later, once adults who bought it because they knew my name or they liked my comics, bought it, or they liked Dave McKean's illustrations, and then they started handing it out to children. And that produced a really interesting phenomenon, which I sort of started to figure out, but only after I'd written the book, which was that in Caroline I'd written something which was not actually a horror novel for children, because children didn't read it as horror. Children read it as an adventure. It had somebody in it a lot like them. They had enough confidence in me as an author from the first page that they presumed quite correctly that Caroline would survive until the end of the book.